Tight of the soup bowl sat in front of me, still giving off a faint warmth, and I felt the weight of everyone's eyes even before anyone spoke. My granddaughter leaned closer, barely moving her lips, and her breath touched my ear. "Don't eat that," she whispered. I didn't look at her right away. I looked at the man across the table, and he was already smiling. He had that polite expression he liked to use around my daughter, the kind meant to show patience and control. But his eyes stayed fixed on me, as if waiting for something small but important to happen. I felt my hand tighten around the spoon. The soup smelled heavier than it should have. There was a sharpness beneath the usual, something that didn't belong. My granddaughter slid back into her seat without another word, but she kept her hands folded tightly in her lap. I saw the way her fingers trembled. She was too young to hide fear well, and I knew she hadn't whispered for attention. She was warning me because she believed I was in danger. I kept my face steady and lifted the bowl slightly, pretending to check the temperature. The spoon felt heavier than it should have, and I let it rest inside the bowl a moment longer than necessary. Across the table, my son-in-law shifted in his chair. He didn't speak, but his shoulders lifted with a soft, controlled breath. He wanted me to take that first sip. I could feel it. The room felt smaller than usual, as if the walls had leaned closer. My daughter talked about something from her workday, but her voice came in uneven waves, and she kept rubbing her temple. She hadn't even touched her own bowl. I watched her for a moment, trying to understand if she already felt unwell or if she was simply tired. Her husband kept answering for her, finishing her sentences, directing the conversation the way he always did when he wanted control. I let my eyes drift toward the kitchen door. The house was quiet, except for the soft hum of the old refrigerator. The evening had settled dark outside, pressing faint reflections against the window glass. I tried to listen for anything out of place, any sound that might explain why a child would be afraid of a meal. Nothing came, just the steady breathing of the people around the table. When I lifted the spoon again, my granddaughter's foot nudged mine under the table. It wasn't playful or accidental. It was a plea. She kept her eyes down, but the message was clear. I lowered the spoon slowly and set it beside the bowl. My son-in-law's smile faltered for the first time, only for a second, but enough for me to see irritation slip through his careful mask. I remembered the last time he brought food to the house. My stomach had twisted for hours afterward, and I blamed age or indigestion because it was easier than doubting family. Tonight felt too familiar. I watched the way he tapped his fingers on the table, slow and deliberate, as if counting how long he could stay patient before forcing the issue. The air felt heavier with each quiet second. My granddaughter's whisper stayed with me as I watched the bowl. I kept my breathing steady while I pushed it a little farther away, pretending I needed more room on the table. His eyes followed the movement. That alone told me enough. I sat straighter and watched him back, waiting for his next move. I've lived alone for 15 years, ever since my wife passed on a cold morning that still feels too close. My daughter was already grown by then, busy building her own life, and I never wanted to be the kind of father who held on too tightly. We stayed connected, but the distance between us came quietly, settling in small spaces we never talked about. I told myself it was natural. A widower shouldn't expect too much company. Still, there were days when the silence in my house felt like a second loss. When she first introduced me to the man she planned to marry, he walked in with a wide smile and a firm handshake. Too firm. I remember noticing that before anything else. He kept his eyes on me a second longer than people usually do, as if measuring something he needed to file away. He talked smoothly, confident in a way that felt polished. My daughter watched him with the kind of admiration I had rarely seen in her, and I didn't want to interfere. But even early on, there were moments when his expression tightened if someone disagreed with him. Quick flashes of temper he buried just as fast. The first time my granddaughter seemed afraid around him, she couldn't have been more than 4. She was drawing on the living room floor during a family visit. He told her to put the crayons away. His voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp, and she froze mid-motion. Something in her small shoulders tightened. She gathered the crayons immediately, head down. He smiled afterward, looking around to see who noticed. I didn't say anything. I still regret that. Over the years, I watched him shape the rhythm of every family event. He decided when dinner should start, where people should sit, when the conversation should change. He never barked orders, just steered things with a hand on my daughter's shoulder or a gentle correction slipped into her sentence. She always adjusted quickly, like it was easier to follow than question him. I told myself I was imagining it, projecting my own fear of losing her to someone else's influence. There were other small things. He always insisted on delivering groceries to my house, even when I didn't ask for them. He told me he wanted to help me stay healthy, but he watched closely whenever I tasted something new. Once, after eating a stew he brought, I spent the entire night awake with severe cramps. Another time, after drinking tea he made, I felt lightheaded for hours. He blamed my age, and I let it go. My daughter brought up my will once during a visit, stumbling through the words as if someone else had pushed her into the conversation. She said she only wanted to make sure everything was organized, but her eyes flicked toward the hallway where he stood listening. I reassured her, but I never forgot how uneasy she looked. Tonight, as I sat at the table with that bowl of soup inches from my hands, those old memories lined themselves up too neatly. My granddaughter's warning didn't come from imagination. The way her voice trembled told me she had watched something she didn't know how to handle alone. I stared at the soup again, remembering the unfamiliar taste of that stew from months ago, the dizziness after the tea, the way he watched me each time as if registering the results. A quiet thought settled into my mind, steady and undeniable. Maybe tonight isn't the first time. I reached into my pocket and pretended to feel a vibration that wasn't there. "Give me a moment," I said, pushing my chair back as if the call couldn't wait. My son-in-law's eyes followed me the whole way. He didn't hide it. His head tilted slightly, and that tight smile stayed fixed on his face, the kind people use when they're trying to pretend they're relaxed. I nodded at him and stepped toward the hallway, keeping my pace steady, not rushed. I wanted him to believe I wasn't thinking about the soup at all. When I lifted the phone to my ear and faked a quiet greeting, I caught a glimpse of my granddaughter. She didn't lift her head, but her eyes moved toward me in a quick, frightened glance. It lasted only a second. She looked away fast, almost too fast, like she had been warned not to show anything. That small movement tightened something in my chest. Children aren't subtle by nature. Fear makes them learn it. I kept the fake call going long enough to make it believable. Behind me, the house stayed quiet, except for the low clink of cutlery. I lowered the phone, pretending to listen, and walked toward the kitchen. I meant only to look around, to see if something felt wrong. But before I even reached the doorway, I heard two voices, my daughter's and his, arguing in sharp whispers. Her voice was thin, strained. His was colder, controlled, the way someone speaks when they want anger to stay hidden. "You didn't have to bring it," she said. "It's fine," he whispered back. "It's better this way." I stood still, listening to the careful rhythm of words. They weren't fighting about dinner. They were fighting about intention. When I stepped closer, the whispering stopped instantly. I waited a few seconds, then stepped into the kitchen as quietly as I could. The room was empty. The back door was shut. The air smelled of spices, broth, and something else, something sharper. I looked around the counter. The dishes were arranged neatly, but the trash bin wasn't fully closed. A thin strip of plastic stuck out from the edge. I opened it and saw the torn-off label from the soup container. It wasn't ripped by accident. Someone had peeled it off and crumpled it into a tight ball. Manufacturers don't remove their own labels. Only people who want something hidden do that. The scent of the soup still hung in the air, heavier than it should have been. I reached the pot on the stove and leaned down. Under the warmth and herbs, a faint chemical bitterness caught the back of my throat. It wasn't strong, but it was wrong. I straightened slowly, steadying myself on the counter, not because I was weak, but because something old and familiar crept into my thoughts. Instinct. The same instinct that had kept me cautious through decades of work and years of living alone. Footsteps approached behind me. I turned just as my granddaughter slipped into the kitchen. She didn't speak. Her eyes moved to the doorway to make sure no one else was watching. Then she stepped close enough for her shoulder to brush mine and pressed something small and folded into my hand. Her fingers were cold. Before I could respond, she stepped back and walked out as quietly as she came, pretending she had only come in for a drink. I didn't open the note right away. I waited until I was sure no one was near, then unfolded it slowly. Only 5 words were written inside, shaky and uneven. "He watches when you eat." I folded it again and held it tight in my palm. The house felt colder. The soup on the table felt heavier than any meal should, and the warning in her handwriting rooted itself deeper than whisper or fear. Something was wrong, and it had started long before tonight. I slipped into the small guest room at the end of the hall and closed the door quietly behind me. The house was never loud, but tonight every sound felt sharper, like the walls were listening. I sat on the edge of the bed and unfolded the note again, letting my eyes settle on the trembling handwriting. He adds things when no one is looking. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of something she had watched more than once. I read it 3 times, each time feeling the same steady pull of unease in my chest. I held the note between my fingers, trying to understand how long she had been noticing things without telling anyone. Children observe quietly. They remember what adults forget they've shown. Her warning wasn't something imagined in a moment of fear. It was learned. It was repeated. I folded the note carefully and slipped it into my shirt pocket, keeping it close as I stood again. The kitchen had always been a safe place in this house, but stepping back into it now felt different. I moved slowly, not wanting my footsteps to echo. The trash bin sat where I had left it earlier, still not fully closed. I knelt and lifted the lid, pushing aside the torn label with the back of my hand. Something small glinted near the edge of a food wrapper. At first, I thought it was part of a spice packet, but when I picked it up, the plastic felt different, lighter, thinner. A small vial, no bigger than a finger joint, rolled into my palm. The inside held a faint smear of residue, pale and powdery. It wasn't enough to identify anything, but it was enough to explain the bitterness I had smelled in the soup. I turned it over once and slipped it into my pocket beside the note. As I stood, my chest tightened with a memory I had tried to forget. Months earlier, he brought tea to my house during a visit. It was a cold afternoon, and he insisted it would help with circulation. I remembered the taste now, slightly metallic, almost sour beneath the sweetness. An hour later, I felt lightheaded, cold, and weak enough that I had to lie down. He told me it was age catching up with me. I believed him because it was easier. I didn't want to suspect the man my daughter trusted. The refrigerator hummed softly, filling the silence. I held onto the counter for a moment, feeling the weight of old mistakes settle in. Ignoring small signs has a way of turning into larger danger. Tonight, it felt like everything I had dismissed had walked back into the room with me. I heard footsteps in the hallway, a steady, familiar stride. Before I could close the trash bin completely, knuckles tapped against the kitchen door frame. "Is everything okay?" he asked, voice smooth and polite, but stretched too thin around the edges. He stood just outside, not crossing the threshold, watching me with that practiced smile. I straightened slowly and wiped my hands on a kitchen towel, keeping my face steady. "Just needed some air," I said, making my voice calm enough to sound believable. The room felt warm. His eyes flicked toward the counter, then back to me. "You left the table so suddenly," he said. "Everything's fine, isn't it?" I nodded, keeping my breathing even while my fingers curled around the vial hidden in my pocket. "Everything's fine," I repeated. "I'll be back in a moment." He studied me for a second longer, and then gave a small nod and walked away with steps that sounded too controlled, too measured for a simple dinner. I waited until the hallway was quiet again before letting out a slow breath. For the first time tonight, I wasn't just suspicious. I was certain something was deeply wrong. I walked back to the table with the calmest face I could manage, even though my pulse felt uneven. The soup bowl was still warm, sitting exactly where I left it. My son-in-law leaned back slightly when he saw me return, but his eyes stayed fixed on the bowl, not on me. I sat down slowly, letting the chair scrape just enough to draw attention without seeming hesitant. When I lifted the spoon, I felt the weight of his stare tighten across the table. I brought the spoon closer, stopping just before it touched my lips. His posture shifted forward by a fraction, almost unnoticeable unless someone was watching for it. I held the spoon there a breath longer, then angled it toward my mouth. Before I could move any further, my granddaughter's glass tipped off the table and shattered on the floor, the sharp crack echoing through the room. She gasped softly, eyes wide, and crouched to gather the pieces. The noise broke the moment just enough. He snapped his head toward her, irritation flashing across his face, before he forced himself to stand and pretend to help. His tone stayed gentle, but it was too smooth, too quick, like someone grabbing a mask they nearly dropped. I lowered the spoon quietly and used the distraction to glance around the table. That was when I noticed something missing. There had been 2 bowls on the counter earlier. I remembered seeing them when I first walked into the kitchen, the one meant for me and another placed beside it. Now only mine remained on the table. The second was gone. A faint unease crept up my spine as I scanned the room, trying to see where it had been placed. Before I could finish the thought, a dull thud echoed from the hallway. It wasn't loud, but it carried the wrong kind of weight. I rose from my chair, steadying myself on the table edge. My granddaughter froze, her hands still hovering above the shards of glass. My son-in-law paused too, his eyes narrowing for a brief second before he slipped back into concern. I stepped out of the dining room and into the hallway. My daughter was slumped against the wall, one hand pressed weakly to the floor as she tried to push herself up. Her breathing was shallow. On the carpet next to her, a half-empty soup bowl lay on its side, the rest of its contents soaking slowly into the fibers. The missing bowl, the one someone must have eaten before I returned to the table. I knelt beside her, supporting her shoulders as she tried to speak. Her lips moved without sound, and her head fell forward again. Behind me, footsteps approached, slow, careful, practiced. He stopped just a few feet away. The polite mask slipped for only a heartbeat. His jaw tightened, and something cold flickered through his eyes before he crouched down beside us with exaggerated gentleness. "Are you all right?" he asked her, voice soft, steady, too controlled. He glanced at the overturned bowl, then at me, then back at her. His hand hovered near her arm, close enough to look helpful, far enough to keep himself clear if anything pointed back at him. My granddaughter stood in the doorway, silent, holding onto the frame with small, trembling fingers. She looked at the bowl, then at me, her eyes filling with a fear that felt older than a child should ever carry. I looked at my daughter again, at the soup staining the carpet and the weakness in her limbs. The truth settled in with a cold finality. Whatever had been in that bowl wasn't meant for one person. It didn't matter who took the first bite. It was never meant for me alone. The paramedics arrived quickly, their calm movements filling the house with a strange kind of order. They knelt beside my daughter, checking her pulse, shining a small light across her eyes, asking simple questions she couldn't answer. My son-in-law stood beside them, arms folded, trying to look worried. "She's been under a lot of stress," he said before they even finished their first assessment. "Long hours at work, hard week. She just pushed herself too much." His voice carried the kind of confidence meant to shut down other explanations. The paramedic closest to him gave a polite nod without agreeing, then turned his attention back to my daughter. I stood a few steps away, keeping my granddaughter close to my side. She held my sleeve tightly, watching every movement, not saying a word. The house felt colder with strangers in it, but safer too. When the second paramedic stood to get the stretcher, I reached into my pocket and caught his eye. "I found something in the kitchen," I said quietly. I didn't want my son-in-law to hear. I opened my hand just enough to show the small vial, letting the faint overhead light catch its surface. His expression changed instantly, not alarm, but recognition. He took it with a careful gloved hand, turning it once. "This shouldn't be near food," he said in a low voice, firm enough that I felt something settle inside me. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was validation. A stranger, trained and neutral, saw the same danger I did. He slipped the vial into a small evidence-style bag and tucked it into his kit without another word. My son-in-law stepped closer then, noticing our quiet exchange. "What's going on?" he asked, too casually. His eyes flicked from me to the paramedic's hand. "Is that necessary?" "She fainted, that's all. People faint." The irritated edge in his voice broke through his careful tone. Before anyone could answer, 2 police officers stepped through the front door. Standard procedure when someone collapses under unknown circumstances, the paramedic explained. The officers asked calm, routine questions: what she ate, how long she'd been unwell, whether anything unusual happened before the collapse. Every question seemed to get under my son-in-law's skin. His responses grew shorter, sharper, as if the officers were accusing him of something they hadn't yet suggested. "She's fine," he insisted. "She just needs rest. This is all unnecessary." One officer crouched beside the spilled soup on the hallway carpet. "Mind if we take a sample?" he asked. My son-in-law's jaw tightened hard enough to show in the dim light. "Why? It's just food." "It's routine," the officer said calmly. "We take samples when the cause of a collapse isn't clear." The tension in the air stretched thin. My granddaughter stepped closer to me, pressing her forehead against my arm. Her voice trembled when she whispered, "He gets angry when she speaks up." The words barely reached me, but they hit with enough force to make my stomach tighten. She wasn't talking about tonight. I placed a steady hand on her back and kept my eyes on the officers. My son-in-law watched us with a look that wasn't worry anymore. It was calculation, fast, sharp, angry beneath the surface. He started pacing in small, tight steps, muttering about overreactions and paperwork. One officer asked him another simple question, and he snapped. "Why are you asking me? I told you she fainted." His voice echoed off the walls. Everyone went still. My daughter was lifted carefully onto the stretcher, her breathing shallow but steadier now. The paramedics prepared to take her to the hospital, moving with quiet professionalism. My granddaughter refused to let go of my sleeve, and I didn't make her. The officers stepped aside but stayed close, watching my son-in-law with the kind of alertness they didn't announce. As they began rolling the stretcher out, I felt something settle in my chest. Not fear this time, certainty. Whatever line had been crossed tonight wasn't something that could be undone or ignored. The questions, the anger, the vile, the soup, the whispered warnings, all of it pointed in one direction. We had reached a point of no return. I took my granddaughter down the hall as soon as the paramedics left with my daughter. The officers remained near the front door, talking quietly, but I didn't want her anywhere near her father's voice or his temper. I opened the door to the small room I used for storing books and blankets and guided her inside. The dim lamp on the dresser gave off a soft glow, enough to keep the shadows from feeling too large. She sat on the edge of the bed, knees pulled close, watching me with wide, tired eyes. I told her to stay here, to keep the door closed no matter what she heard. She nodded without speaking. The moment I stepped back into the hallway, I heard him in the living room. His footsteps hit the floor in hard, uneven bursts. "Dramatic," he muttered loudly. "This whole thing is dramatic. People faint. People get tired." He knocked something off the table. I heard the dull thud. And then another object hit the floor. He wasn't trying to calm himself. He wanted everyone to know he was angry. One of the officers approached me. "We're going to need preliminary results before we can do anything further," he said quietly. "We'll return once we have them." He gave me a look meant to reassure, but it only reminded me how alone this house would feel once the uniforms walked out. My son-in-law stood behind him, arms crossed, trying to look offended by their presence. "Finally," he said, "let's end this circus." The officers stepped outside, promising to come back soon, and the door clicked shut behind them. The silence that followed was heavy, not peaceful. My son-in-law paced the living room again, muttering under his breath. I didn't go near him. I went instead to my study, the only room in the house where I kept things exactly as I wanted them. I opened the bottom drawer of the desk and pulled out a folder of documents I hadn't looked at in months. My will, insurance statements, bank forms. I kept everything organized, but I had never gone through the most recent paperwork with the kind of suspicion I felt now. When I opened the updated file, my stomach tightened. My daughter had signed forms only a few months earlier, forms naming her husband as her primary beneficiary. Not me, not her child, him. Her handwriting looked rushed, not careless, but pressured, as if she had signed because saying no would have caused trouble she didn't want to deal with. I held the page still, reading it twice, feeling something cold settle behind my ribs. She would never have done that on her own, not with how she had always promised that what little I left would go to her daughter. This change wasn't her decision. It had his fingerprints all over it, even without ink. I placed the papers back in the folder carefully, as if the truth might spill out if I handled them too roughly. My granddaughter's note pressed against my chest with every breath. The memory of the vial in the paramedic's hand drifted through my thoughts. All the warnings, all the moments I had ignored, all the times he had insisted on controlling things, it all aligned too neatly now. A sudden clatter came from the kitchen. I stepped out of the study and listened. The door slammed shut, followed by a low string of muttered words I couldn't fully catch. He had locked himself inside. I heard the faucet run for a moment, then stop abruptly. Drawers opened. Something metal scraped loudly against the counter. Whatever he was doing in there wasn't normal preparation or cleaning. It sounded frantic, angry, unfocused. I stood at the end of the hallway, feeling the weight of the house press in around me. I thought about my daughter in the ambulance, my granddaughter hiding in the spare room, the torn label in the trash, the half-eaten bowl on the floor. I thought about the years I tried to convince myself he was only controlling, only difficult, only proud. But tonight, I couldn't ignore what was right in front of me. Not anymore. The truth had been circling this house for a long time. Tonight, it was coming to meet me head-on. I drew a slow breath and steadied myself. Whatever happened next, I had to face it. The truth had to come out before this night ended. I walked toward the kitchen slowly, keeping my steps steady so he wouldn't hear panic in them. The house felt tight, as if every wall leaned inward. When I reached the door, I tried the knob. Locked. I could hear him moving inside. Quick, sharp gestures, drawers opening and closing, something glass tapping against the counter. His breathing sounded uneven, the way someone breathes when they're trying to stay calm and failing. I knocked once, not loud, just enough. "We need to talk," I said. The noises inside stopped. For a long moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. Then the lock clicked, and the door opened just a few inches. His face appeared in the gap, tight around the jaw, eyes too bright. "What?" he asked. "You want another theory about your daughter fainting? Or maybe you want to accuse me of ruining dinner?" I looked at the counter behind him. The soup pot sat open. Beside it lay another torn label, a small plastic cap, and something that looked like a vial half hidden behind a bowl. I didn't move toward them. I kept my eyes on his. "I'm asking about the soup," I said quietly. "Why you watched me so closely when I lifted the spoon? Why she collapsed after eating her portion?" His fingers clenched around the edge of the door. A small twitch moved across his cheek. "Because you old men need watching," he said, the words slipping out before he could polish them. "You think you can live forever, taking up space, dragging everyone down." He stopped, realizing what he'd said. But it was too late. The mask he always wore cracked straight through, and the anger underneath came out clean. He pushed the door open and stepped out fully, the overhead light catching the sweat on his temple. "You old men live too long," he snapped. "You don't know when to step aside. You don't know when you've become a burden." On the counter behind him, I saw his hand reach back and close around something small. When he lifted it, the light caught the clear plastic. Another vial, not empty this time. He held it with a tight grip, not even trying to hide it. My pulse kicked hard, but my voice stayed steady. "That won't get you what you want," I said. He took a step closer. "You think so? You think any of this was about want?" His voice shook with a heat I'd never heard before. "You're the one standing in the way. You always have been." I shifted just enough to put myself between him and the hallway, where my granddaughter waited behind a closed door. He noticed, and something dark flashed in his eyes. "Move," he said. "No." He stared at me, chest rising and falling too fast, fingers tightening around the vial. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then a soft sound floated down the hall, a faint groan. My daughter. She must have been conscious enough to hear us. The moment her voice reached the kitchen, his expression changed, panic replacing anger. He turned his head slightly, listening. She called out again, weak, confused. "Dad?" I saw the calculation hit him hard. He realized she had heard enough. He realized she might remember later. He started toward the hallway, but I stepped directly into his path, blocking him. I didn't raise my hands. I didn't threaten him. I just stood there, firm enough to say I wasn't moving. Before he could decide what to do, sirens cut through the night air outside. He jerked his head toward the window. The police were back sooner than expected. Their radios crackled as they approached the front door. My son-in-law's breathing grew ragged as he looked from me to the hallway to the counter. The door burst open. "Sir, step away from him," one of the officers said, voice firm and level. In the sudden light of their flashlights, everything became visible at once. The torn labels, the vials on the counter, the residue inside them, the overturned bowl from earlier, and the financial papers I had left on the table when I searched through them. The pieces he had tried to scatter across the night gathered themselves into a single picture, one he could no longer hide. He looked around wildly, searching for a way to explain it all, but the mask wasn't coming back this time. Not tonight. The officers moved in quickly, their steps controlled and deliberate, and my son-in-law froze only when he realized there was nowhere left to go. One of them told him to put the vial down. He hesitated, his hand trembling, then set it on the counter with a sharp, reluctant tap. They turned him around, secured his wrists, and guided him toward the living room. He didn't shout or argue anymore. The fight drained out of him the moment the lights hit the evidence on the counter. He kept his head down, jaw tight, breathing fast and shallow, as if the walls themselves were closing in. I didn't follow. I stood in the kitchen doorway, gripping the frame with one hand, until the tension slowly bled out of my shoulders. The house felt different now, still heavy, but in a way that came after a storm, not during it. A voice called from the hallway, weak but clearer than before. My daughter lay on the stretcher the officers had carried back inside after determining she needed to be moved quickly. The paramedics worked around her with steady hands, adjusting oxygen, checking her pulse again, preparing her for the second trip of the night. She looked at me for a moment, confused and frightened, trying to understand what had happened. I stepped closer, keeping my voice low and steady. "You're going to be all right," I told her. "They're taking you to the hospital." She tried to speak, but the effort made her wince. The paramedic reassured her softly, telling her to save her energy. I touched her hand briefly before they wheeled her toward the front door. Watching her leave the house like that, pale, exhausted, held together only by the care of strangers, hit me harder than anything that had happened tonight. My granddaughter appeared at my side, clinging to my sleeve again, silent but steady. I kept her close. When the officers finished securing her father in the patrol car, one of them approached me. "We'll run tests on everything," he said. "The soup, the containers, anything that might contain residue." His tone was professional, but the concern in his eyes felt personal. "From what we've seen so far, there's enough here to take this very seriously." Another officer returned from the patrol car and shared a quiet update. They had looked into prior financial documents, cross-checking statements and activity that raised flags, insurance forms, beneficiary changes, unusual withdrawals. My son-in-law had been maneuvering for months, maybe longer. What started as control had grown into something more deliberate, more calculated. The substances in the kitchen, they said, would be tested as soon as possible. The vial the paramedic had taken earlier was already being processed. My granddaughter held onto my arm as the officer explained how these situations often unfolded, not sudden, not random, but built over time through pressure, manipulation, isolation. "He wanted control of everything," the officer said quietly. "Financial, medical, household. Your daughter changing her beneficiary lines up with that." Hearing it confirmed by someone trained to recognize these patterns settled a dull weight deep inside me. I thought of all the times I brushed off small warnings, all the moments I convinced myself he was simply difficult or prideful. Tonight, those small pieces had shown their true shape, and it was worse than anything I'd allowed myself to imagine. They asked my granddaughter if she was willing to say what she saw. She looked up at me first, as if asking permission, then nodded. Her voice was quiet but steady as she described how he watched me every time I ate something he brought, how he added little things into pots or cups when no one was paying attention. The officers listened carefully, not rushing her, letting her speak in her own time. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Her courage in that moment felt larger than the room we were standing in. When the patrol car pulled away, taking him into the night, I stood in the doorway and watched the flashing lights fade down the street. The house slowly settled into silence, the kind that came after danger had passed, but left its imprint behind. I held my granddaughter's hand, feeling the small, steady grip that had saved my life tonight. The weight of everything that almost happened pressed against me, the fragile safety of elders, the ease with which harm can hide behind politeness, the way trust can blind even the cautious. Relief didn't come all at once. It arrived slowly, mixed with grief, fear, and a quiet, heavy gratitude. Tonight could have ended a different way. The house felt different in the morning. Not lighter, not exactly peaceful, but still in a way that let the air settle again. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of warm water, watching the sunlight stretch across the floor. My granddaughter climbed into the chair beside me, her hair still messy from sleep, her eyes softer now that the night was behind us. She leaned her shoulder against mine without saying anything. Sometimes silence is the safest place for a child to rest. I asked if she slept at all. She shrugged. "A little." Her voice was quiet but steady. She reached for my hand and held it with the same grip she had kept through the whole night. I didn't pull away. I let her sit close, letting her feel safe in a house that had felt dangerous not long ago. We didn't need many words. The calm of the morning spoke enough. When my daughter finally returned from the hospital later that day, she moved slowly but with more strength than I expected. She sat down across from me, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes tired and red. My granddaughter stayed beside me, half hidden behind my arm, but still listening. My daughter swallowed hard before speaking, her voice catching slightly. "Dad, I'm sorry," she said, "for not seeing things, for not hearing her, for not hearing you." I studied her face. She wasn't looking for forgiveness. She was looking for truth. I shook my head gently. "This isn't about blame," I told her. "It's about what happens from here." She nodded, tears forming but not falling. She looked older than she had yesterday, as if the weight she carried had finally shown itself on her skin. I didn't want to add more to that weight. We need new rules, I said. For the house, for all of us. She straightened a little, listening. No one brings food here unless everyone sees what goes into it. No paperwork is signed without both of us present. No decisions are pushed through without time to think. And if something feels wrong, even the smallest thing, we talk about it immediately. My daughter wiped her face with the back of her hand and nodded again. I understand, she whispered. I should have said something earlier. I rested my hand on the table, palm open. We all should have, I said quietly. But we start now. My granddaughter leaned forward then, placing her small hand over mine. She looked between her mother and me, her expression serious, in a way no child should ever have to manage. I tried to tell you, she said softly, not accusing, just telling the truth. My daughter reached for her and pulled her close, her voice breaking. I know, sweetheart, I know, and I'm listening now. I watched them for a moment, feeling something settle inside me. Not relief, not closure, but a kind of steady understanding. Last night had taught all of us something that would stay for a long time, not just about danger, but about silence, about how harm doesn't always come in storms or shouting or obvious cruelty. Sometimes it comes quietly, sometimes it cooks dinner, sometimes it smiles across the table and waits for you to trust the wrong moment. I looked at my granddaughter, remembering her small whisper in my ear, the one that had kept me alive. A warning delivered with more courage than most adults manage. That whisper had been the turning point of everything. It was the moment a child protected an elder when the elder should have been protecting her. As the morning light grew stronger, I let out a slow breath and spoke the truth I had been circling all night. Danger doesn't always come with noise, I said. Sometimes it smiles across the table. My granddaughter squeezed my hand, as if sealing the words into something we wouldn't forget. Thought about others my age, men and women who trust too easily, who don't want to seem paranoid, who let politeness bury instincts. We grow quiet as we get older, but the world doesn't always grow quiet with us. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is listen to that small shift in the air, the uneasy feeling in the gut, the whisper from someone who sees what we don't. We owe that to ourselves, and we owe it to the ones who rely on us to stay alert, because elders must trust their instincts and protect the vulnerable, especially the ones still learning how to speak.